In this video, sponsored by Archvillain Games' new sci-fi villain line of 3D printing STL files, I'll show you how to quickly and easily weather your vehicles and big stompy robots. Entropy is a hell of a thing. It affects all of us, to be sure, but it also affects vehicles. All vehicles start out, shiny and factory new, and then, the gradual decline of entropy adds scratches and rust and dents and so on. You've probably had this happen to your car. I've had it happen to mine in the past, but it doesn't just happen to cars. It also happens to, vehicles and big robots and cool stuff like that. And this is certainly true on the battlefield, where our miniature vehicles fight each other over imaginary, borders and disputes. I love painting vehicles, and specifically like big robots that have seen better days. I've done several of them, and I really enjoy those types of projects, all of the weathering that you kind of have to do. And I've found recently that many people don't enjoy that painting process. I believe it's because they're doing it wrong. Freehanding all of it can, well, A, take forever, and B, be easily goofed up, you know what I mean? If you're just going to completely try to do it all with a brush. There are techniques with hairspray and table salt and all of that stuff, and those can work well, but they can also sometimes be a bit of a hassle. So I'm going to run you through the fast and simple process that I like to use for weathering vehicles and big robots and such, so that hopefully it seems more enjoyable and easy to you and allows you to get your battle-hardened vehicles onto the tabletop sooner and in greater numbers. Here we go. I wanted to paint this pretty impressive mech from Archvillain Games Sci-Fi Patreon tier for the month of February. More about that at the end of the video. And I started by priming it black-brown by Monument Hobbies with my airbrush, and then zenithal highlighting it with Army Green over Militia Green from the Army Painters airbrush paint line. For some reason, initially, I immediately thought about painting it all silver, like my Necrons, but it didn't make any sense to do that, really, because really, vehicles specifically, almost none of them are ever just straight silver. Most big metal vehicles, they're painted a color. Tanks, construction equipment, giant robots, etc. The closest thing that we have to big stompy, war robots in the real world are, like I mentioned, construction vehicles, most of which I don't know the names of, as it turns out. Like backhoe, I think, is definitely one of them. Anyway, interestingly, construction vehicles are sometimes turned into mechs in some, stories, books, game lore, stuff like that. I've seen it in all kinds of different things before. So the evolution of construction equipment to battle equipment, that there's precedent for that. There's a lot that we can actually take from looking at real world construction vehicles, like the fact that they're painted, and not silver, like I was thinking about doing. And then, through, you can take a look at all the paint that rubs off, and then, and if they get rusty. Even well-kept construction equipment will show weathering over time. And that construction equipment isn't out there on the field of battle. It's like building a supermarket out by the highway or whatever. So we can, if we'd like, go beyond the weathering that we see on the vehicles out by the new supermarket and use those examples as a jumping off point on our big stompy robots or hover tanks or whatever. So I like to start by looking over the model and, after I've primed it and done all the base coating and whatever, looking for places that seem like they would probably rub against like trees and rubble and stuff like that as they move through a battlefield. Protruding edges and the like, that kind of stuff. Then I start with a dark brown color, Monument Hobbies Dark Umber, and I put a blob on a dry palette, and I find myself a piece of foam or sponge, all kind of depends on what you like. I dab it into the dark umber, dab it off on a piece of paper towel, and then I start dabbing it onto the model, focusing mostly on the edges. When we're doing this, we're simulating old rust. As paint gets chipped off of, something and the metal parts start to oxidize, the rust is usually orange initially, and then eventually turns dark brown. We're starting with the oldest layer, the dark brown, of all the rust, and we're dabbing it on with the bit of foam. It's important to remember to rotate the foam a bit too, so that the pattern of rust speckles don't seem to repeat themselves on, bigger areas. You can go as far as you want with this step. It all depends on how old and or beat up you want your vehicle to look, right? I can't tell you when to stop, frankly. It's better for you to kind of get a feel for it yourself. Best way to figure it out is to like start with a little, go a little ways and all that kind of stuff and get the model and then take a look at it from all the different angles. And then over time, after time, decide if you should stop or if you should keep going. Next, I'd tell you to do the same thing again, but with a dark orange paint to simulate newer rust that hasn't completely oxidized yet. However, you don't have to if you don't want. The dark brown is pretty necessary for this look. You need the dark brown, but sometimes the orange step can be a little bit overdone. It can maybe add a little bit too much color sometimes to your model, and you may not want that. If you decide you do want to, I'd tell you to do far less of the orange than you did of the dark brown, if you even do any at all. Now, this next layer is pretty necessary, and that's finding a slightly lighter color than the base color of the model to simulate texture to a degree and to simulate damage done to the paint job that doesn't get all the way down to the bare metal. So now, in this case, I used a color called Dark Yellow Green from Monument Hobbies, a Vince Venturella Signature Series color, I might add. And I did the same kind of foam dabbing treatment, focusing a lot more on some of the like flat areas and stuff like that. The main idea is to get a color like just a bit lighter than the base color, dab it all over the place, and it kind of, again, like I said, gives you that visual texture and also makes it look like some more damage. Now you have a much more interesting looking vehicle that has clearly seen some better days, but like how recently were those better days? If you want this vehicle to be quite old, then you could skip the next step if you wanted to. But if this vehicle is still in service and getting into scraps, then you'll want to break out your favorite silver paint. In my situation, it's going to be Vallejo Model Metallic Air Silver and like a new piece of foam, and then just start dabbing on the edges to show paint chips that have chipped all the way down to the metal. Again, it's usually better to err on the side of caution and not overdo it with this silver. Stop from time to time and take a look at the model, all over. A bright silver showing as scratches on a vehicle can sometimes look great, but they can also sometimes add too much contrast and extra detail almost to a model and make it look way too chaotic. Going slowly and stopping before you go too far is a really good idea. The interesting thing about real-world military vehicles, and I've talked about this a bunch in videos before, is that they're generally manufactured all in one color. Therefore, it's a good idea to generally use transparent colors like contrast paints, speed paints, shades, washes, whatever, to help differentiate parts a little bit from each other without really changing the color. They're transparent, you put them over that color, they look different, but they're still the same color, right? So I used Agrax Earthshade to darken up some parts on this model in certain spots, things that looked a little bit more mechanical or like linkages, things I just needed some differentiation in color but didn't want to make them a different color. I just needed there to be a value change, stuff like that. Now, if you're okay with trying some edge highlighting or maybe just practicing edge highlighting, start with that kind of lighter than color from before, that dark kind of, dark yellow or yellow green or whatever, and start sliding the edge of your brush along some of the edges of the model. This will look like a bit more damage to some degree, especially if you kind of stagger it a little bit, stipple it some. But it will also sometimes, when you go straight line, just look a little bit like actual edge highlighting, which isn't really a bad thing. Again, do a little, see how it works, look the model over, and then decide if you want to do some more. You can probably be done at this point, and start painting the other details of the model that aren't weathering and all that kind of stuff and, finish it up. But sometimes you want to go further, either because you want your robot or vehicle or whatever to look grungier, or maybe you're just enjoying yourself and having a good time with the process, which I've done sometimes to an extent that I should have probably stopped. But either way, skeleton horde contrast paint makes a great kind of low-key rust on lighter to mid colors. I wouldn't use it on black. I'm not sure quite yet what to use on a really dark, black type robot or something like that. But on anything else that's like a mid to light color, the skeleton horde contrast putting it over in little spots. You can just easily stipple it on in small areas, and it adds more visual texture to the model, but it's also still transparent, so it's still giving that green through there, but the color is starting to get a little warm, and it's starting to look a little rusty. Now, if you'd like, you can go back and even do a bit of edge highlighting with your silver paint. But again, be careful. It can be very easy to overdo it, and then your model can look completely outlined or kind of like Tron, which you really don't want. An easy tip to create a gradient with contrast paints across like a flat panel, which vehicles do frequently have, is that first you get the panel wet by just painting water, just normal paint water, onto the panel with your brush. Then, while it's still wet real quickly, you dip your brush into your contrast, in this case, again, Skeleton Horde, and then you kind of dab the contrast onto one side of the wet panel, very frequently, probably towards the bottom of the wet panel. And then you can kind of move it around with the brush and stuff like that. But as it dries, it'll become more like a glaze, and gravity will kind of help keeping the dark stuff at the bottom, and then, where you don't really have that much contrast in the water up towards the top, and it will build this gradient, make it look like a fade, and that just is a simple way to add a little bit more grunge, but also a little bit of a gradient to any kind of flat panels that you might have. Also, if you had some spots that are really standing out too much with the silver, like if you had too much on the foam when you were poking at the thing or whatever like that, you can go back and kind of fix them somewhat by putting that same Skeleton Horde contrast color over parts of the bigger silver blobs. Don't necessarily completely cover them, because you still want some silver and then also some rusty silver, but this will kind of help to break up the silver spots somewhat and make them look a little bit older. I also went through, as I was doing this whole weathering process, of course, and painted all of the details on the big robot that I needed to paint. The hydraulic pistons, the cables, the pilot guy who's all sort of stuck in there, all that kind of stuff. And then after that was all done, it was then time for a last bit of simple weathering, and that is soot. I used coal black from Monument Hobbies, which I think is a great soot color, and a soft makeup brush to add soot to the ends of like the gun barrels and that particle gun thingy on his left arm. Again, it was just the normal dry brushing. Using a paper towel kind of makes it a little bit drier and dustier, which is what you want for your soot, right? You'd do this same thing probably on any kind of exhaust ports that a vehicle might have as well. Then the absolute last bit of weathering, and I do this frankly on all of my models, not just big robots and vehicles and stuff like that. After painting the base, I usually add a final dry brush of a light color to the base, usually a light gray or something like that. In this situation, I always make sure to get it onto the legs and the feet of the model as well, adding kind of like environmental dust onto the model as it moves through the landscape. It really kind of helps to tie the model and the base together too. I hope you learned some fun weathering ideas that you'll be able to use on your, vehicles and big stompy robots. And I also want to thank the sponsor of this video, Archvillain Games. They provided the 3D printed mech model that I used in this video. You probably know Archvillain for the amazing line of fantasy STL models they've been providing for years through their Patreon and in places like My Mini Factory, but now they're getting into science fiction models made specifically for wargaming with their sci-fi villain line. Subscribe to their sci-fi villain tier on Patreon, link down below, and get new releases each month. This month's set is Transcended the Awakening, and you'll get also their Star Vault pack, which has like 9 pieces of terrain, 5 Explorer models, and a dragon. Check out all of the Transcended models in February and prepare for all the other new sci-fi models they'll be releasing each month on Patreon, and then on My Mini Factory after that. Thanks again to Archvillain Games for sponsoring this video, and thanks for watching.